In their 2019 manifesto, the Tories promised a better deal for renters. Details included the abolition of no-fault evictions and a scheme to allow a single deposit to be seamlessly transferred from one landlord to another. Now, finally, the white paper laying out those reforms is here, and while it contains some good news for renters, you won't be surprised to hear it doesn't go nearly far enough to level the playing field between landlords and their tenants. Here are the key parts. First, the dreaded Section 21 no-fault evictions. They were introduced under Margaret Thatcher, will be abolished. At the moment, a landlord can simply tell a tenant to leave with only 2 months' notice and without giving any reason. In the future, a landlord will have to provide reasonable grounds for the eviction. What those grounds will be hasn't yet been made clear, but disappointingly, it's already obvious that it won't be limited to misdemeanours on the part of tenants. That's because the white paper also codifies new grounds for eviction, including a landlord wanting to sell the property or move a family member in. Of course, in all these discussions, the elephant in the room is when it comes to price, namely that the rent is just too damn high for most people in England, and especially if you live in a big city. On that front, the white paper says, we will only allow increases to rent once per year, replicating existing mechanisms, and will increase the minimum notice landlords must provide of any change in rent to 2 months. We will end the use of rent review clauses, preventing tenants being locked into automatic rent increases that are vague or may not reflect changes in the market price. Any attempts to evict tenants through unjustifiable rent increases are unacceptable. Of course, the criteria used to assess what is and isn't justifiable will be what's key here. If a landlord can say it's reasonable to hike rent by 15% because that's how the market has moved, that wouldn't provide much security for the tenant. For more details on the significance of the reforms, I spoke earlier to Glyn Robbins, a visiting fellow at LSE who specialises in housing. I began by asking him how significant he thought these reforms were.
I don't mean you could deny that if all of those things happen, then it would undoubtedly improve the situation for a lot of private renters. I think there are still many questions to be asked about that in a broader sense. But of course, if you're relieving tenants of that constant anxiety around the threat of a no-fault eviction, never knowing where you're going to be living in 6 months or even 2 months' time, potentially having some degree of, I wouldn't call it certainty, but assurance or reassurance around rent levels and some of the other things, yeah, of course it would be an improvement. But I think, as I say, we need to wait and see. The landlord lobby are very schooled at grinding these sorts of reforms into virtual nothingness. And I'm sure their lobby will be actively trying to do that again. Having said which, I also think there's some issues around, and this takes us into the sort of broader question, I suppose, which is, from my point of view, the private rented sector will never really be a solution to housing need in this country. We need to be looking elsewhere for that. No amount of playing around with the law around private renting is going to alter that from my perspective. What actually needs to happen is far greater investment in council housing. And I believe that is the tenure of choice, if you will, for a lot of private renters. A lot of the people I know living in private renting at the moment aren't there because they want to be. They're there because there's no choice. I'm certainly with you on council housing. So I live in an ex-council flat now rented by a private landlord for presumably 3 times what it would have been otherwise. So I think we share an image of what the solution is here. It's, I suppose, sticking to sort of the specifics of this piece of legislation, or at least this proposed legislation. It seems to me what's really important is what explanations a landlord is allowed to give for evicting someone. So they said no fault eviction has gone. A landlord will have to explain why they're kicking you out. But as far as I understand, that can include they just want to sell the house or they want to move a family member in there. Now, from my perspective, that's still the tenant hasn't been at fault, right? So at the end of no fault evictions, you still can get evicted without having done anything wrong. So how significant is it to say we're getting rid of Section 21? Again, I agree with you. I think it's, potentially it's just a fig leaf. As you say, what this goes to ultimately, and this becomes almost an ideological debate around the rights of property owners and this sense that is inviolable and that their rights as property owners always trump your rights as a tenant. And if that is the situation that you're presented with, as you say, and it could be a contrivance, it could be a capricious explanation. Oh, my long lost son's just come back from Australia or whatever it happens to be. How much better off is the tenant going to be? Again, I guess some of that will go to the detail and the legalities of this. But I'm sure, like you, Michael, I've seen lots of private renters evicted with the most flimsy of explanations, even given how weak the law was before. And I guess the other thing about this is, and again, I apologies if I'm straying into wider territory, but, again, it goes to this idea that somehow there's some sort of equality in the law between the landlord and the tenant. And if the two parties go off to court, there somehow will be some kind of fair judicial system. And that just isn't the way the legal system works. The legal system is there to protect capital, to protect private property. And so given the scenario that you've just suggested, I think almost inevitably you're still going to be evicted. It may take a little longer. It may be that it costs the landlord a little more. But ultimately, I don't see this really doing anything fundamentally, which is what needs to happen fundamentally, to shift that balance of power between the landlord and the tenant. I don't think this is going to do it, even if it is as good as it looks like it could be on paper. I still think you're right. This won't solve the problem.
The other ambiguity in the white paper, as far as I understand, is what I'm obsessed with, which is price. The rent is too damn high. Obviously, the Tories are not proposing rent controls here. They have said that they will be trying to give tenants recourse against unreasonable increases in rent from a landlord. Now, I've got no idea what that means. If that just means it has to be in line with market rents in the neighbourhood, then that's not going to be of much comfort to someone like me, because the rents in the neighbourhood are going up high. A landlord can be doing something which isn't unusual and it still be disastrous for the person renting their home. So, what do you make of the references to unreasonable rent increases in this white paper?
Again, let's take your case. Say it comes back as inflation plus 1%. Well, that's going to be an 11% rent increase at the moment, given where inflation is at the minute. And those are the sorts of calculus that is usually used around these things. So you're right. In the end, it does come down to the rent is too damn high. I spent the latter half of last year in New York with private rent and campaigners over there. Rents in New York have gone up 33% in the last year. 33%. Now, obviously, some of that is a post-COVID, or if we are post-COVID factor. But I think it would be naive to think that we're not. Well, I think we're already seeing signs of rents rising over here as well, and they will continue to rise, I suspect, given everything else that we know about the state of the economy. So again, it's going to be cold comfort to you, isn't it? If you're told that the amount that the rent can go up is by inflation plus 1%, well, that's still effectively going to be an eviction order, isn't it? Because I assume you're not going to be able to afford that. And I also assume that however this legislation is couched, ultimately, as I said, the power will lie with the landlord. And if the rent isn't paid, the eviction order will follow. I don't think anything is going to change that, unfortunately. Having said which, there's a lot of brilliant and growing private renting campaigns around the country now. They've been pushing for this for years. I don't want to pour cold water on it. I just think we need to be realistic. And forewarned is forearmed, in the sense that we need to build that housing justice campaign alliance on the broadest possible front, but also be aware of these wider issues, because this potentially, as I say, is really just is a fig leaf and a pretense, and also a normalisation. I often remember when I studied housing many years ago, or started to study it. In 1914, 90% of people in the UK were private renters. 90%. Now, I'm not saying that this government or any other neoliberal type government necessarily wants to or thinks it can go back to 90%, but I've seen it double. You've seen it double, the number of private renters in the last decade or so. So, I think they want to go back to that situation that my grandparents had, where there was no alternative but to private rent. And under those circumstances, the whip hand is only with the landlord.
That was Glyn Robbins discussing some of the many limitations of these reforms. That doesn't mean they haven't got the right wing in a tailspin, though. The Telegraph, in particular, is a sight to behold. Following the publication of the white paper, they complained there won't be any small landlords left by next year. The piece uncritically quotes a number of landlords who say things like this. So Bethany Jameson, a landlord with 2 buy-to-let properties. I'm appalled at the government's constant interference in the private rented sector. Landlords own the properties, not the government. We have paid for these properties and they are our pension. It is a big assault on our property rights. Now, if I had a house, I would bet it that Bethany Jameson did not pay for her property. Her tenants did. Buy-to-let, how it works. You put up the deposit, then your tenants pay the rest of the mortgage. So this is my property. I paid for it. I should be able to do what I want with it. I bet you, Bethany Jameson, if I'm wrong, email michael@novaramedia.com and tell me that you actually paid for that house, not your tenants. Because, as I say, what do I have I could bet? Not a house, unfortunately. It's a big assault on our property. Come on. Right. Let's go to David Carter. He is a landlord with 13 properties. Still complaining. He says, I cannot take risks on tenants without the safety net of Section 21 and being able to get repossession without having to explain. So for this guy, the imposition of having to explain is too long, right? I bought this house. I get paid $2,000 a month for doing absolutely nothing, but I still can't possibly imagine having to explain why I'm evicting someone. He hasn't even been told you can't evict anyone. He's been told you have to explain. And that is too much for this guy to handle. It's mind-blowing. The next we have for you is in the Telegraph, David Frost. So David Frost was in charge of Brexit for a while. And he has made this argument. The Tory assault on buy-to-let is another step on the road to socialism. He expands on that point by saying, every step on this road may seem reasonable in isolation. The measures seem justified. The costs seem limited. But there is only one end to the journey. You don't live in a free society. Instead, you live in one where you can't use your property as you wish, only as the government says you can. That is collectivism. That is socialism. Now, this is a former government minister saying that landlords having to give people an explanation before they make them homeless, that is socialism. He's saying we are on the road to hell if you have to give an explanation to someone before you make them homeless. If renters who have essentially paid your mortgage so that you can have a decent pension, you can't just kick them out on a whim. Wow, that is the road to socialism.
This is a great entry for right-wingers posting their L's online, because what he accidentally revealed there was the central principle of capitalism, which is that property rights are more important than human rights, right? Like, property rights is a more universal and important thing than human rights. And so the ability of a certain class of people to assert those property rights is systematically placed above the ability of most of us to live in dignity, to have some kind of stability, and all of the things that go along with stable housing. And of course, this law, while it makes things slightly better, it redresses that inequality slightly in a little bit, like just the tiniest amount. The law doesn't fundamentally change that principle. It doesn't fundamentally change the fact that property rights trump all other rights under capitalism, and that is the system that we live in. In a lot of European cities, you actually have rent controls. And so Britain is actually incredibly out of step with comparative economies with the rest of Europe in terms of how little it protects renters and how much it protects landlords. And so this is the tiniest step towards redressing that. But one thing I found particularly egregious in those Telegraph quotes was this attempt to portray landlordism or suggest that there is a version of landlordism that is salt of the earth, mum and pop, like kind of hardworking grifter landlordism. First of all, you own 3 houses, Karen. Like, most people in this country don't own any houses. And secondly, the whole idea of, well, you can't come after it because this is our pension. Well, perhaps you shouldn't have endorsed a system in which the ability of a small class of people to, stop working at 60 relied on them holding working class people hostage for the audacity of needing somewhere to live and not having tens of thousands of pounds in the bank to drop on a deposit. So that is a systemic issue, and you don't redress that, even if this whole notion of the kind of the grassroots landlord, which in itself is a laughable idea, but even if you take it on those terms, the system is clearly broken and needs to be demolished, because that is an illogical way to run a housing system and as a way for people to build a retirement fund or whatever. So really, even on its own bizarre and laughable terms, the portrayal by the Telegraph of this as some kind of aggression against innocent people doesn't even hold up.
To give the smallest defense of the odd landlord here and there, I would say, I'm sure, I don't know any personally, but I'm sure there are some people who have worked hard. Potentially they were self-employed, so they didn't have a decent pension plan. They bought, one buy-to-let house, which they rent to people, and that is their pension plan. And if that were to crumble, they don't have another plan. I can see why that would be stressful for them. Let's take that scenario and I'll put my sort of sympathetic hat on here. Who would say, what's a sensible way that we can look after people in their own age as a society? How about we get arbitrarily, randomly chosen people who are going to be at the bottom half of the income spectrum because they don't own a home? How about we let pensions be the responsibility of poor people who will arbitrarily have to give 40% of their wage every month to pay the pensions of people who were potentially self-employed or didn't have a good pension scheme? Now, however sympathetic you are to that person, that is a crazy way of running society. Like, you could not think of a more immoral, unjust way to say, how do we deal with an aging population? Let's randomly charge a few people who weren't lucky enough or rich enough to own property. Let's make them pay the pensions of everyone else. That doesn't make sense. If we have a problem with people not having enough money for their pensions, we should be progressively taxing people so that the money comes from rich people, not disproportionately from poor people, as it does if you have a pension system which is essentially based on people who work arbitrarily being chosen because they're poor to fund the pensions of people who are, on the spectrum wealthier than them. It couldn't get more unjust, yet that is the system which we have, and that is the reality which is used to defend the status quo, as if that's suddenly, oh no, you can't take away these people's pensions. Why am I paying their pension? That's not how it should work. I mean, I'm happy to pay people's pensions if it comes out of my tax and it's proportionate to what I earn and everyone pays it. I'm not happy to pay people's pensions if it's purely because I have nowhere else to live, right? I'm not happy to do that. I'm sorry. All of us here at Novara Media are working harder than ever to keep scrutinizing establishment politicians and the media barons who protect them. We don't have billionaire funders. We don't have advertising partnerships. We're funded entirely by you. If you've ever thought about supporting us, now's the time to go to novaramedia.com/support and donate anything you can from just £1 per month. Defy the corporate media. Join our monthly supporters and help build our supporter base to 10,000 strong.